What I will be talking about today is what one might call the Ottoman Republic of Letters. And this was a network of men of learning that spanned really all across the huge, sprawling Ottoman Empire, from the Ottoman holdings in southeastern Europe through to today's Turkey, across the Middle East and into North Africa, into predominantly Arabic-speaking regions. So although this Ottoman Republic of Letters was contained within a single empire, it was one that crossed a number of different ethnic and linguistic boundaries, to a lesser extent religious boundaries. I won't be able to talk about that very much in my talk today, but I'm happy to answer questions about it and reflect on it in the Q&A. So rather than to merely document the existence of this network, which itself I think is necessary and a valuable contribution, I'd actually like to focus on two a bit more specific questions. Now, the first is, how was the Ottoman Republic of Letters constituted? So what were the mechanisms? What was the sort of connective tissue that held this network or this republic together? That's the first question. And the second question I'd like to talk about is sort of, so what? That is, what were the consequences of this particular form of network, right? What were the consequences of these mechanisms, these peculiar, I think, mechanisms that held this network together? So let's start with the first question, which is, how was it constituted? What was it made up of? Now, the Ottoman Republic of Letters must be thought of as just one part of a larger Islamic Republic of Letters that, as you can see from this map, spanned all the way from West Africa to Southeast Asia, really starting already in the late medieval period and picking up, accelerating, intensifying in the early modern period. This network, about which others have written, including Ibn Bimbash, who is with us today, was constituted, I think, measurably, in large part, through a shared set of texts. Most notably, as you can imagine, the Quran and the Hadith, that is the accounts of the Prophet Muhammad. And of course, they were held together by a shared language, a shared lingua franca, which was Arabic. And of course, Arabic took a particular importance across Islamic communities because the Quran was in Arabic, and Arabic was thought to be the word of God. The Quran was thought to be the word of God, let's say. And so this, of course, necessitated Islamic scholars and jurists across the region to have a very deep knowledge of Arabic, and used it not only for religious purposes, but also for scholarly purposes. So there's a growing body and a wonderful body of literature on this topic, and I won't be talking about it much today. What I think has been underemphasized, sometimes overemphasized, especially in the older literature, not so much in the newer literature, and what has been underemphasized, I think, in the Ottoman case, is really the extent to which this community, this Republic of Letters, was sustained not by a written culture, but by a live, in-person culture of sort of face-to-face exchange and encounter. And this was true both in the Ottoman Empire, I think, and far beyond the Ottoman Empire. So while I'll really focus my comments on the Ottoman case today, I think a lot of what I'll be saying actually holds true across the larger Islamic Republic of Letters. So I would argue that one of the key mechanisms that constituted the Ottoman Republic of Letters was what I call, and what other scholars have also called, the gentlemanly salon, the salon. So what was the salon? Well, across the Ottoman Empire, scholars and literati held special gatherings for the purpose of social intercourse and entertainment, to be sure, but also really for enlightened conversation and for scholarly exchange. So I call them salons, and I feel empowered to call them salons because of a series of parallels I think that do exist with the 18th century French salons. We know it. There's a huge premium put on wit, on eloquence, the ability to articulate one's ideas, on erudition, though notably the one great difference is the lack of, or the absence of women in these Ottoman or Islamic salons. Again, something I can't talk about today, but in the talk, but I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. Now, these gatherings were often held in the domestic sphere in magnificent reception halls like the one preserved today in Berlin from the early 17th century in Aleppo, but they were often also held in publicly accessible spaces, things like the sort of central prayer halls of mosques or gardens that were accessible more widely. So these salons, as my research, I think, tries to show, these salons really shape the written word in the Islamic world and in the Ottoman Empire at every stage of its existence. Now, this begins with the very idea to write a book. Often, scholars in the Islamic world had the idea to write a book, or generated the idea to write a book out of a particular salon conversation. Often they were in response to debates that were held in these kinds of gatherings that were unresolved or that scholars felt needed further treatment, but there were also a variety of, let's say, more literary genres that also had their origins in these live gatherings. Once the idea of a book was hatched, it did not exit the salon and enter the sort of the silence of the scholarly study. Rather, scholars we know from anecdotal reports continued to discuss their ideas and their works in progress in these gatherings as well. And in fact, in many of the paintings that document these kinds of gatherings, we see a mix of already sort of bound and completed books, but also loose leaf paper, suggesting the sort of coexistence of books at different phases of their existence. But it was really upon the completion of a book that the most intense phase of its social life began. So very often, one of the main sort of events of these literary or scholarly soirees was in fact a live recitation of a particular book or the explication of a particular text. And this included not just the sort of more lighthearted sorts of written works that you might expect on such a soiree, things like travel accounts or poems, but also far more cerebral and I think rigorous types of scholarly works, such as Quranic commentary or Hadith commentary. So I think these kinds of live gatherings really account measurably for the ease and the rapidity with which ideas traveled across the Ottoman Empire. Elite Ottoman women were highly mobile. They had many, many reasons to travel across the Ottoman Empire, including pilgrimage, serving on campaign, looking for a patron, finding a teacher, taking up a new appointment, right? An incredibly mobile society. And the first thing that these men would do when they arrived in a new locale was to join these kinds of gatherings. So they were highly permeable to outsiders. What they would do on these gatherings is often inspect one another's books. You can see in both of these cases that the men are gathering with their books in the background. This is sort of like an early modern, I guess, Zoom, ideal sort of Zoom background, isn't it? What we have here. And we have accounts of scholars inspecting one another's books, and in the wake of those inspections, asking to borrow those books, asking to have those books be copied by scribes for their own personal use, and hence then moving across the empire with these scholars. In some cases, the word or the notice of particular books or particular debates actually traveled faster than the books themselves did. So on occasion, we have certain books that inflamed huge debates, And we find that the news of these debates traveled much more quickly than the books did themselves, so that people would actually start to cast judgment on those books without, in fact, having read the books, in having a chance to read them. So in all of these ways, I think salons, these sort of live gatherings, had a very, very important role in consolidating the empire as a sort of intellectual community. And what it did, I think, over time is to ease or dampen some of the differences that existed between scholarly communities across the Ottoman Empire. So my own work really focuses on exchanges between Turkish-speaking scholars from Anatolia and Arabic-speaking scholars from Syria and Egypt. And I would say on the eve of the Ottoman conquest of the Arab lands, of this region right here, which happened in 1516, 17, these two scholarly communities were actually quite separate. They actually had quite a fair amount of differences in their scholarly preferences and their orientations. And what happens in the wake of the conquest, in large part through these gatherings, is the sort of erasure of these, not the erasure, but the sort of softening of these kinds of differences. And really leading, I think, over the course of several hundred years of Ottoman rule over Arab lands to a convergence in scholarly cultures between these two regions. So to my second question, why did this matter? So what? What were the consequences of these sorts of live interactions? Doubtless, there are many consequences of the fact that scholars sort of continuously toggled back and forth between the written and the spoken word, but I'd really like to focus on only one of them, and that is that as a consequence of the importance of these live encounters, ideas did not travel as abstract, disembodied entities, but they really traveled in ways that were highly personified, as highly personified entities attached to particular individuals. So what do I mean by that? Well, salons were highly ceremonial occasions that were regulated by really a thicket of social etiquettes, of precepts of what to do, what to say, how to stand, etc. And the status of a particular individual determined many aspects of his experience in a salon. It determined, first of all, whether he could host at all. So hosting a salon was a matter of privilege, right? Not anyone could host a salon. Rather, it was a sort of sign of certainly wealth, but also of one's power, that one could sort of force others to muddy their boots to come visit you rather than to leave the house yourself. So that hosting itself was a mark of prestige, but hosting then also led to a series of other privileges, including being able to sort of shape conversation and determine the sort of pathways of particular conversations. But these kinds of restrictions applied not only to the host, but also to the rest of the assembled guest as well. So the status of a particular individual, his learning, his office, his wealth, his lineage in some cases, could determine where he sat in the gathering. So even though these sort of circular arrangements might look like they create sort of social parity amongst the various participants, in fact, people thought of these seating arrangements as highly hierarchical. So the host being at the sort of center, occupying the most prominent place, and then the rest of the participants sitting in accordance with their social status, descending outwards, let's say, from the host. Who one was also determined what one could say. So etiquette manuals stipulated, again, that the sort of more powerful man should have the prerogative of shaping the conversation. And of course, counseled that it was unwise to contradict a social superior, or even in some cases to compliment a social superior, as that was seen as condescending. So what this means is that ideas, when they were passed around the salon, did not circulate in a sort of impersonal, free marketplace, right? But they were given substance, they were given weight and value by the size of the turban of the person who was articulating them, right? And by his location within the room. So just to give one very brief example, when a very prominent 16th century scholar of Damascus claimed that he had found 7 errors in the Arabic dictionary of Firuzabadi, the whole gathering, as we know from a later account, the whole gathering was sort of shocked by this, the enormity of this claim, as Firuzabadi was enormously respected across the Islamic world. However, no one dared in that instance to counter the scholar as he enumerated one by one each of these errors. And in fact, interestingly, it was only after the fact, after the gathering, that someone then wrote a letter to the scholar challenging him on some of his claims. But again, this suggests that ideas were not only evaluated on their intrinsic value, of course they were evaluated on their intrinsic value, but they were also evaluated and judged on the basis of who was holding them. So, so what? So to offer just some concluding thoughts about what this may tell us about intellectual exchanges within the Ottoman Empire, or also more broadly. First of all, I think the importance of Ottoman salons reminds us of the importance of considering oral and written transmission of knowledge in tandem. And I think we often focus on, we sort of follow the text. So we often focus on or track the movement of ideas through the movement of text. But I think in the Ottoman Empire, and probably in many other cases, it was really oral communication, the oral transmission, that acted as a sort of fast track by which ideas could circulate, with written text actually just trailing them, months or sometimes years behind. Second, it also reminds us of the importance of grounding our analyses of written controversies, that is, of treatises, however seemingly sort of stale and removed from daily life, how important it is to actually try and connect those to their social context. Then, I think, as now, ideas were not evaluated in a vacuum, and they were given meaning and weight and charge through their association with individuals and through their association with particular contexts. And indeed, I actually think that doing this, reconnecting ideas and their social context, actually gets us closer to the way in which contemporaries, at least in the Muslim world, tried to read their texts. So one of the most popular genres that we find across the Islamic world is that of the biographical dictionary. Now, what is a biographical dictionary? It's essentially a compilation of biographies of individual scholars. In these biographies, yes, we hear about people's scholarly trajectories, we hear about their education, we also hear about their moral rectitude. We often hear details about how they looked, how they dressed, and of course their social networks, and of course their triumphs and defeats within the context of salons. And I believe that actually one of the functions of these biographical dictionaries, the reasons why they were so important, was because they allowed scholars to reconnect individuals to, or let's say reconnect ideas to the individuals that held and defended them. And finally, again, while I've focused on the Ottoman Empire, it's important to say that these kinds of networks existed possibly in slightly different form, but in very similar ways across the Islamic world, that is across political boundaries rather than only within them. So just to give one example of a 16th century Ottoman gentleman, Sayyidi Ali Reis, when he traveled to South Asia in the 16th century, he was welcomed immediately into very familiar salons, was able to deploy his usual wit, his poetry, and his humor and his knowledge to regale To be sure, this world had its limitations. It was mostly Muslim. It was almost exclusively male. But nonetheless, I do think that it suggests the need to balance our accounts of European globalization with an understanding of a parallel globalization of ideas that happens within the Islamic sphere. So I think the Islamic Republic of Letters really was an alternative and no less powerful engine for intellectual globalization across the medieval and early modern Islam. And excuse me, medieval and early modern world.